It's my pleasure to introduce Gene Roth. Gene has a BA and a graduate degree in modern European history. He taught history in high school for 30 years, including advanced placement classes regarding American and European history. He's been a member of HUMTC since about 2015 and is obviously one of our most sought after speakers. Today, he'll deliver a presentation on Putin's savage attack on freedom, causes, and consequences. Gene, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks for your kind comments. Again, it's my pleasure to address you all on this very pertinent topic. A couple of weeks ago, the program committee suggested, before the invasion, they suggested that it might be a good idea to talk about the Ukraine. And lo and behold, this is a more viable issue than you can imagine right now. So I have a lot of information. I hope I'll be able to cover it. I also want to make sure we leave time at the end for questions and comments. I really enjoy your insights and your knowledge of the topics on a weekly basis. The topic is Putin's assault on freedom. It's not Putin's assault on Ukraine, because this is not just an assault on a peaceful country that wants to be left alone. This is not a topic about the greatest war on the European continent since 1945. This is an assault on the liberal world order, as it's known, by primarily revanchist nations led by China and Russia, who want to remove the influence of democratic liberal market economies on the world order, which was set up primarily by the United States and Britain and France after World War II, with the structures that we have in place, political and economic structures, to basically say to nations, if you want our cooperation and you want prosperity and you want peace, you have to live by rules. The rules that we prefer are, if you can, democracy, representative government, limits on what rulers can do with relation to their interaction with other countries. And we have structures like the United Nations, the GATT agreement in 1947, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and other regional political and economic groups that were set up to help countries modernize, to give foreign aid, and of course, always with the attachment that we want you to use this money in what we think would be prosperous services to your people, not setting up a dictatorship. The goal of the Chinese and the Russian leadership today is to destroy that world order, to separate the support of the United States from Europe, to separate European nations from each other, and to expand whenever possible the influence of the Chinese and the Russians throughout the world. China's Belt and Road initiative is a good example. But with regard specifically to Ukraine, I have broken up the topic into the issues that Putin, over the last 10 years or more, has been raising as to why Ukraine has to be brought under his control. And basically, there are 3 or 4 issues, some of which are absurd, some of which have more validity than others. So we'll take them one at a time. But basically, in interviews with leaders, in statements to the press, in statements on social media, in statements on television to the Russian people, Putin has said, Ukraine has to be denazified. We'll talk about that in a minute. Ukraine has to stop the slaughter of Russian people living within its borders. NATO is a threat perceived by the Russian people and by Russian leadership, and NATO has violated their agreements and pushed border membership of nations right up to Russia's western border. NATO should not have expanded up to our border, and we perceive it as a threat. Ukraine has been constantly suggesting that it wants to become a member of NATO, and we don't want to allow that. And finally, I want to talk about the personality of Putin and how it contributes to his behavior, which many people consider irrational and dangerous for the world community. So on Friday, the day before yesterday, March 18th, on the front page of the New York Times, and then a lead article further on in the paper, it says, the article says, in conjuring Nazis in Ukraine, Putin stokes Russian memories. Let me just read a few sentences from this. I know it's boring to hear people read, but I'm going to try to do it as fast as quick as possible. Ukraine's quote, Ukraine's government is openly neo-Nazi and pro-Nazi, controlled by little Nazis, President Putin of Russia says. American officials led by President Biden are responsible for the Nazification of Ukraine. The language of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been dominated by the word Nazi, a puzzling assertion about a country whose president, Vladimir Zelensky, is Jewish and who last fall signed a law combating anti-Semitism. Mr. Putin only began to apply the word regularly to the country's present-day government in recent months, though he has long referred to Ukraine's pro-Western revolution of 2014 as a fascist coup. And then the article goes on at length to talk about the details of how the word Nazi and fascist touches a very tender chord among Russians who fought World War II and lost more lives than any other nation during that entire war. But the article also suggests the whole thing is absurd. Ukraine being a Nazi-controlled country. The other argument that Putin has been raising for years is the Ukrainian slaughter of Russians who live amongst the Ukrainians. This has to do with the development of Ukraine and Russia and their relationship throughout history. In parts of Ukraine, there are heavy populations of ethnic Russians, and these ethnic Russians consider themselves not to be Ukrainians, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine and in Crimea. Those two areas that Putin annexed in 2014. And beginning in 2014, there has been fighting between Ukrainians and Russians in armed conflicts of military groups. Russians have been coming into Donbass and Crimea without identification on their uniforms. Ukrainian soldiers have been shooting and killing Russians and back and forth. But the idea that Ukrainians throughout Ukraine are persecuting and killing Russians is just, again, like the denazification issue, silly propaganda. Reminds me of when Hitler began to march toward reconquering parts of Europe, another revanchist idea. He has to redraw the map of Europe to suit Germany after the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. So the issue was for Hitler at that time to get control of Czechoslovakia. So he did it step by step. And the first step was that the Czechs are killing and beating up Germans in the Sudeten Mountains of Czechoslovakia. When they drew the peace treaty for Czechoslovakia in 2018, they gave the Sudeten Mountains to Czechoslovakia to act as a protective barrier against invasion. Unfortunately, they ignored the ethnic, or they did not find a way to settle the issue of the ethnic composition of that region, which was heavily German. So in order to get control of the Sudeten Mountains, Hitler created this propaganda campaign. Among other things he said were that the Czechs were constantly beating and killing the Germans in the Sudetenland. And of course, the Munich conference occurred in the fall of 1938, and Czechoslovakia was partitioned. The Sudeten Mountains were given to Germany, and again, of course, over the protests of the Czechs, who begged the French and the British to join them in fighting the Germans, and the French and the British refused. Incidentally, when the Germans eventually occupied all of Czechoslovakia the following spring, the German High Command told Hitler that if the British and the French and the Czechs had stood up to us, they had more advanced weapon systems than we ever imagined. They probably would have defeated us. And then, of course, after taking control of all of Czechoslovakia in the following spring of 1939, he went on to make demands on Poland, and the Poles never agreed, and that led to the invasion of Poland by Stalin and Hitler in September of 1939. He began to make the exact same claims that Poles are beating up, killing, and stomping to death Germans living in, at that time, the city of Danzig, which was the city at the edge of the Baltic Polish corridor. And I was watching on television a few weeks ago some of the excerpts that Putin was showing to the Russian people on the news program. All the news in Russia now is controlled by Putin and his minions. And you saw a woman a woman in her 50s being dragged out of a car and stomped on, literally stomped on, or the Western media said these are all staged by Russian actors. But it appeared that this poor woman was being stomped on by Ukrainian men. But the whole thing just brought all of this back to my mind. No one in the West who watches or follows these things takes them seriously. So sufficient to say that's all we're going to talk about, the denazification of Ukraine and the slaughter of Russians by Ukrainians. Now I want to talk about the issue that has a lot of traction in some parts of the United States, and according to Putin, is the number one issue that upsets him about Ukraine and justifies his invasion of Ukraine. And that is the spread of NATO right up to the Russian border. So we're going to talk a little bit about that issue. And basically, Putin has been saying NATO has no right to request joining, Ukraine has no right to request the ability to join NATO. Ukraine is not a separate part of Russia. It has always been part of Russia. And NATO should never have allowed itself to expand from its original 12 members to the current 30 members. So let's take that statement and see how much validity it has. So the idea is that, according to Putin, we in Russia perceive NATO's encroachment eastward and Ukraine's petition to join Ukraine as an existential threat to our security and independence. Again, Ukraine has always been a part of Russia. It has no right to act as an independent country. Now, let's take a look at that. Ukraine has sometimes been a part of Russia and sometimes it has not. The idea that Ukraine and Russians are the same, essentially, is propaganda that Putin has been spreading for years and years. The Ukrainians, like many people in Eastern Europe and also in Central Asia, have always maintained a separate identity from Russia. There were times in their history when they were controlled by other empires, and there were times when they were controlled by Russia. Russia actually began in the 9th century as a trading post set up by the Vikings, and it was, or the Scandinavian people, and it was called Kiev Rus, and it stayed that way for a few centuries. It was always referred to as Kiev Rus. Beginning in the 15th century, Russia began to be called Muscovy, and Russia began to expand westward toward Europe and more easily eastward toward the Pacific. And all of Russian history in its foreign policy has a dominant feature of expansion eastward and westward. And the truth is, if you examine this issue historically, all of the peoples, the ethnic groups in Central and Eastern Europe have been dominated by many empires, and ultimately part of it by Russia. But to say that these peoples are part of Russia is not true at all. They always maintained their separate identity. Their languages were different. Their written language was different. The religion was different. They themselves kept an identity which was separate from any of the conquering empires that occupied them. So I'm talking about Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians. They all consider themselves to be different from the peoples who occupied them and the empires who occupied them. It was a flux, depending upon what part of history you were talking about, the 15th century, the 17th century, the 16th century. All different empires occupied people in the periphery of what is now Russia. And they were the Swedes, believe it or not, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Hungarians, the Ottoman Turks, and the Mongols. They were called the Tatars. Those empires occupied all of what we know to be today Eastern Europe. And every ethnic group every group that I just mentioned in all those centuries kept their identity separate. And although they obeyed their conquerors politically, they did not consider themselves Mongols or Russians or Swedes or Magyars, Hungarians, or Ottoman Turks. They consider themselves to be these ethnic groups, Lithuanians, Estonians, and Ukrainians. When they got their first opportunity, and then finally in 1793, more modern times, Catherine the Great actually annexed Ukraine and brought it under Russian influence, which it would remain a province of Russia until the end of the Romanov dynasty in 1917, throughout the Soviet period, and it began its independence in 1991. The other parts of Eastern Europe that were under Russian control or German control or all the other empires that I just mentioned, they got their independence at the end of World War I. And they instantly set up in 1919, World War I was over in 1918, they instantly set up functioning independent governments. And they were all those countries that I just mentioned, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, the Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. They all instantly set up their own countries and functioned as independent countries until World War II began, and they were taken over and occupied by the Soviet Union and became satellites of the Soviet Union. Then in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of these countries, including for the first time in history, modern history, Ukraine, they all declared their independence. And instantly, from the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the way down to Ukraine, these countries operated as independent nations. Again, they saw this as natural because they had kept their identity with their language, their history, their culture, their religion, their alphabet. They kept that identity as separate, alive for centuries. So too did people in Central Asia and the Russian Far East. The Crimean Tatars are a perfect example, but Uzbekis, Tajikistanis, Kazakhstans, they all kept an identity. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of those countries, many of those ethnic groups also proclaimed their independence. So the idea that Putin has been spreading that Ukraine has always been a part of Russia, an integral part of the government of Russia, is absolute nonsense. And they have every right, of course, as a country, to demand their own foreign policy, which was, as far as Ukrainians are concerned, ever since the early 2000s, not only to be part of NATO, but to be part of the European Union, which again infuriates Putin. So let's look at NATO. What the heck is this thing called NATO, which most of you are completely familiar with? NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, began with 12 countries. It was part of something called the containment policy of the United States. The containment policy emerged at the end of World War II. Harry Truman is the president now. And the United States leadership begins to realize that Stalin is not an ally against fascism. He's becoming an enemy of the United States and democracy. So they created this policy called containment. Actually, it came out of a secret anonymous diplomatic note written by George Kennan in 1947, secretly sent to the State Department. Anyone who chooses to can read the contents of this secretive note. George Kennan was at that time, and for many years, the leading Russian scholar in America on Russia and how to handle its leaders in a way that avoids war. So this telegram comes over, and eventually it's made public. And the telegram basically said, what we have to do as a country is form a defensive alliance. Let the Soviets know we are strong and we are willing to work together. Basically say to the Soviets, where your armies and your satellites exist today, we will leave you alone. We are not going to declare war and recover anything you have acquired since World War II. However, if you try to expand your influence using military means, there will be a war. And in addition to the NATO, the Marshall Plan, and the European Union was established. All of these structures were set up to prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union. 7 or 8 years later, the Soviets set up the Warsaw Pact to theoretically oppose NATO, but NATO was always a defensive alliance. It's the only alliance the United States has ever been in permanently throughout its history. It's about 75 years old right now. The containment policy set up by the United States was ultimately a brilliant strategy. And it basically said, as Kennan mentioned in his secret telegram, it's called a secret telegram because he never signed it, or he signed it with the word anonymous, but everybody in the American government knew who it was from. And he said, eventually the Soviet Union will probably exhaust itself, maintaining its empire, and will not serve any purpose for us to try to diminish its power where it already exists, and just leave it alone. Now that whole containment policy with the Marshall Plan, the European Union, which Schuman, the Frenchman Schuman set up, which became the European Union, Common Market, and so on, with all those other, the GATT, the IMF, the World Trade, all of those institutions were set up to get nations to behave themselves and not be aggressors, to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union. And it worked. When you look back, except for the Korean War and the Berlin blockade, which in the end turned out to favor containment. The Berlin blockade was established in 1948 by Stalin to starve Berlin into submission to Soviet control in Eastern Germany. The United States instituted a massive airlift, bringing in fuel, food, and water so Berlin wouldn't starve to death. Literally millions of people would not starve to death. And in 1949, Stalin lifted the Berlin blockade. It was a test of containment. The Korean War was another test of containment. Mao Zedong eventually invaded North Korea. Mao Zedong and North Korea eventually invaded South Korea, but they got permission from Stalin to do that. And in the end, it produced a stalemate, and nobody won. So it was containment. It was not a gain on either side. The ultimate proof of NATO not being an aggressive threat to anyone occurred in the middle 1950s, 1954, 1955, 1956, when popular revolts broke out in East Germany, Poland, and Hungary. And the Soviet Union ultimately sent in troops and tanks to crush those revolts. NATO never once supported those revolts, sent in money or troops or weapons to any of those insurgents. That's proof conclusively that the idea that NATO is going to expand at the expense of Soviet satellites or Soviet territory is refuted by that. The next issue was in 1968, the Prague Spring. Czechoslovakia at that time threatened to liberate itself from Marxist dogma and create a more democratic society. And it became a crisis for the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev Doctrine was proclaimed. Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, and it was crushed. NATO did nothing to support the insurgents. And finally, when the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, and every ethnic group that I just mentioned, 20 or 30 ethnic groups that I've just mentioned, Russia basically is not just Russians. I should have mentioned this before. Russia as a nation is a collection of racial and ethnic groups that are different from each other. When the Soviet Union began to collapse in 1991, NATO did nothing to further what the Russians saw as provocations to further the insurgents. They stepped back deliberately, and they opened negotiations with Gorbachev to make it clear to him that we're happy this is happening, but we will not antagonize your control. We will leave it up to what you decide to do. And in the end, the Russians did nothing, and it was part of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost to liberate life in the Soviet Union and make it more responsible to the needs of the people. But what it did was, of course, help create the conditions where the satellites in Eastern Europe revolted, and the NATO did nothing. Same thing with the rise of the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1980-81 under Lech Walesa. It was a serious crisis for the Russian government. They were even deciding whether to send in troops to Poland and occupy it. And eventually, and NATO did nothing. They allowed the Poles and the Russians to settle this on their own. So why am I spending so much time on this? I don't want to bore you with all these details, but this notion that NATO is perceived as a threat, and we as a nation had no right to expand NATO after the Soviet Union collapsed, has been getting a lot of social traction and political traction here in the United States. The Russians have always complained that NATO was perceived as a threat to them. That's their issue. We have, I think I've just proven that NATO is really not a threat, but if they perceive it as a threat, that's how they perceive it. In the United States, several members of Congress who belong to not only the Democratic Party, but also belong to what is called the Democratic Socialist Party, have said and have been holding conferences among other members of Congress to condemn NATO for expanding right up to the border of the Soviet Union, and said that this is a sign of aggression and we should not have done that. So let's see whether NATO should have done that. So what you had was the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991. And between 1994 and 2004, all the nations of Eastern Europe that bordered the Soviet Union petitioned membership in NATO. Nobody forced NATO on them. Nobody used financial assistance or tariffs to control their request for admission to NATO. And all the nations from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all the way down to the Black Sea requested admission into into NATO. The Soviet Union sent signals that we are furious about this. Georgia and Chechnya also began to consider requesting membership in NATO. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So basically, the political leaders of Europe and the United States had a dilemma. We know the Russians are going to see this as a threat. We're not. We know we're not a threat. History proves we're not a threat. But they are clearly sending signals to us. We don't want you to let those nations join NATO. The nations surrounding the western border of the Soviet Union said, in effect, you can't leave us up to the mercy of history, or the content or the course of history, or the promises of Russia. We have experienced domination for centuries by powerful empires, powerful nations, including Russia. We don't trust their promises or Russia's promise. We would rather rely on Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which is the Three Musketeer article. An attack upon one member of NATO will be perceived as an attack upon all, and automatically, every member of NATO, when one single member is attacked in any fashion, will come to the aid automatically of that nation. This is what these nations said from 1995 to 2004. This is what they were telling the Western leaders. We want protection from Article 5 rather than parchment promises from Russia that they will never expand westward. So that was the dilemma that the members of NATO faced. These people were petitioning to be members, or we don't want to make NATO appear to the Russians as a threat. So NATO leaders all agreed that every member of the European group that bordered Russia on the west, if they want to be members of NATO, provided they are not repressive dictatorships, we are going to let them in. And that's exactly what happened. Basically, the Russians were furious. Gorbachev was furious about this. Secretly, in back channels, the United States said to Gorbachev, if you allow this to happen, we are going to give you foreign aid as you are going through this liberation of perestroika and glasnost. And these individual groups are petitioning independence or breaking away from control. We will give you money. And from 1994 until 1998, the United States gave the Russian government huge amounts of money just so they wouldn't object strenuously to the expansion of NATO. So that's the story of Putin's. That's the story of the legitimacy of Putin's claim. And the Russians still say NATO is a threat to them. But I gave you this quick background to suggest that NATO is not a threat. The interesting aspect is that in America, there are groups, the Democratic Socialist Party, especially in the Northeast, they are active. The Democratic Socialist Party is very active in New York City, Boston, and other parts of the Northeast. And they are also subscribing to this notion that NATO is a threat, is perceived as a threat, rightfully so, by Putin. So let me go on to the next issue and talk about Putin's background and what it reveals as to his ultimate motives and what kind of a person he is. I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I definitely want to invite everyone to make comments and contributions. Putin was born and raised in what is now St. Petersburg. He was raised by his mother, a single parent. When he became a teenager, he went to the local KGB station and requested that he be allowed to be trained as a KGB agent. They said to him, "We don't really want you at this point." He went to law school, and after law school, when he was about 25 years old, he again petitioned the KGB to accept him as a candidate for training, and they did. And after 4 or 5 years of being trained as a KGB agent, with a specialty in counter-espionage, he was sent out on his first assignment to what was then considered a backwater, insulting assignment in Dresden, East Germany. And he became the head of the KGB station in Dresden, which was also, ironically, Dresden was the head city of the Stasi. The Stasi was the German secret police. And the Stasi was always in collaboration with the KGB. When in 1989 the Berlin Wall was attacked and began to was broken apart by Germans by Berliners on both sides of the wall, a mob assembled outside of the KGB Dresden headquarters. Putin said to his subordinates in the building, load up your rifles. We're gonna kill them all of these people protesting on our steps in front of the building. But first, I want to get permission from Moscow, from the KGB headquarters in Moscow. So he called repeatedly into KGB headquarters in Moscow for permission to kill the protesters who are protesting in front of the KGB headquarters in Dresden. Dresden is far in Eastern Germany, far away from Berlin, and Moscow never responded. So he was afraid to act, and he did nothing. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe declared their independence. Soviet influence in Eastern Europe disappeared, and Putin traveled back to St. Petersburg, and he began to work in local politics. And he became a typical bureaucrat in the mayor's office, and he worked his way up, and he became a favorite of the mayor of St. Petersburg. At this time, Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Soviet Union. I mean, the president of what was becoming Russia, getting rid of its Soviet connections. Boris Yeltsin noticed Putin and took a liking to him. But by that time, Boris Yeltsin was a troubled alcoholic and had serious problems about issues of corruption. Many of his friends, cronies, and members of his family have been dipping into the treasury and stealing millions and millions of dollars in money. Eventually, it became clear to Putin he has to resign. He can't handle the job. He was acting erratically in many ways. But he, believe it or not, he picked Putin to be his successor. And he knew he had to groom him and present him to the Russian public slowly. So he brings him to Moscow. He makes Putin the head of the SVR, which in Russia at that time was the successor to the KGB. This is interesting. The KGB decides that Putin is nobody special and sends him to Dresden. Boris Yeltsin decides that Putin is so valuable that he's going to make him the head of the new basic intelligence agency of the new Russia. Putin becomes head of the SVR, the Russian intelligence agency, and then a few months later, he eventually became the prime minister, and then in 2000 he becomes president very quickly. Now, why am I talking about that? Because as soon as Putin became head of the SVR, suddenly there were terrorist attacks appearing all over parts of Western Russia. And some of these were horrible. There was one attack in Beslan in which the terrorists took over a school with hundreds and hundreds of children from kindergarten through 9th grade. And Putin, at that time, head of the SVR, according to many people, savagely attacked this school with unnecessary violence and brutality to get rid of and kill the terrorists. But in the process, over 300 young children were killed. And then quickly, as soon as the terrorist attack was over, equipment was moved in to remove any traceable evidence that this might have been an overreaction on the part of Putin. Other terrorist actions occurred, again, right after Putin becomes head of the SVR. And they found in several cities, apartment buildings were being blown up in the middle of the night. And Putin began to use these as excuses to put limits on political expressions and freedoms of the Russian people. And he's doing this as he then becomes prime minister and then becomes president. Interestingly, one of the buildings where the bombs were did not explode and go off and kill people. They found out the bombs that were in this apartment building were bombs that were used by the Russian army, not terrorist equipment. So many people knowledgeable in Russia, and many people in the West saw this as an excuse by Putin to popularize himself, to make himself seem as a protector of Russia, and to set the stage for the gradual encroachment upon all of the freedoms and liberties the Russians at first had when Boris Yeltsin stepped down. Putin, before he became president of Russia, always publicly made statements that he is all in favor of glasnost, perestroika, and all in favor of Boris Yeltsin's policy, which was real, that Russia has to liberate itself and become, as much as possible, a real democracy. As soon as Putin becomes president, he begins to close down the free TV networks, close down opposition newspapers. Suddenly, journalists abroad and journalists in Russia begin to get killed or disappear, including people living in England. And that prompts a huge number of, as I told you earlier, that prompts a huge number of the border states on the western boundary of Russia to appeal more than ever for membership in NATO, because they see that Putin is becoming a dictator. And basically, the largest number of member states into NATO as new nations occurs in the year 2004, because it became very clear to people in not only Eastern Europe, but everywhere, that Putin's on the road to dictatorship. So I bring this up to show you the kind of calculation and treachery that Putin holds in his heart. In 2008, a rebellion breaks out in Georgia and Chechnya to break away from Russia, and Putin again comes in with Russian troops, and according to military experts in Europe, America, and even in Russia, he over-slaughters, over-destroys, overreacts, and levels huge parts of Georgia and Chechnya as an example of what life would be like if you rebel against Putin's rule. What Putin really is afraid of are demonstrations and popular uprisings like the Arab Spring in 2012, like the Yellow Revolution in Ukraine in 2012 and 2014, in which governments that are considered repressive are removed. He fears that. Interesting, I have to jump back to the year 2000 when he becomes president. He gave a series of interviews to leaders, Angela Merkel, Tony Blair, and Madeleine Albright. Clinton at that time was his last year in the presidency. Clinton sent Madeleine Albright to Moscow to talk and get the lowdown on Putin. And for 2 hours, Madeleine Albright spoke to Putin. A couple of months ago, she published a long editorial in the New York Times describing in detail what that interview was. And she was shocked. She said that Putin told her, and other leaders said the same thing, that the greatest disaster of the 20th century was not World War I, not World War II, not the use of the atomic bomb, not tsunamis or floods. The greatest disaster that befell the world in the 20th century was when the Soviet Union collapsed. He thought that was the greatest disaster, and he made it clear that under his control, he is going to restore what today we, as people in the diplomatic community would say, we have to restore our, meaning Russia's, spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, essentially restore the satellite states. The Russian foreign policy uses two phrases: near abroad and far abroad. Near abroad would be all the countries of Eastern Europe that border Russia's western boundary. That's called the near abroad. The far abroad would be Germany, France, the United States. So Putin made it clear using that phrase, we want to restore the near abroad as a Russian sphere of influence. And so the first step in doing that is to destroy the independence of the largest of the non-Russian ethnic groups, Ukrainians, into under the control of the Russians. So all this time, the Ukrainians are still requesting membership in NATO, and the NATO leaders are hemming and hawing right up until now about letting Ukraine in because they know it's going to cause a real problem. They let all the other countries enter, but Ukraine was a special problem. So in February 2024, in February 24th of 2022, Putin invades Ukraine after he spent a year building up the troops along the Ukrainian border, almost 200,000 troops. Why did he pick then? Because according to Putin and the interviews he had with other people, he sees the West, especially the United States, in a period of decline. He sees we have street violence, we have an opioid epidemic, we were a disgrace in abandoning Afghanistan and exiting. We allowed the Syrian ruler in 2012 to Assad in Syria used chemical weapons against the Syrian insurgents, and Obama told Assad, if you use chemical weapons, we are not going to tolerate it. Obama am drawing a red line in Syria against the use of chemical weapons, which he ultimately used and killed thousands of Syrians, and Obama did nothing. That struck Obama. That struck Putin as a serious incident of decline. We basically did nothing. The only time NATO, for example, took up military action in Europe in its whole history was to stop the genocide in the Balkan Peninsula in 94, 98, 99. But of course, NATO didn't gain any territory. That was to stop people in the Balkans from killing one another. But he said, even now, the United States won't stop something that they called a red line, the red line in Syria. This is an indication that the United States is in decline, and this is probably a sign that I can do what I want. And then, of course, he had President Bush visiting him in Moscow. Condoleezza Rice said, "I was sitting in the audience and I almost fell over off my chair when I heard President Bush in a press conference after the meeting with Putin say, I looked into his eyes and I understood this man, and I was dealing with a man who was honest." Condoleezza Rice herself said she had no idea this was coming. She said nobody in the State Department or in the president's office gave him any inkling to say such a thing, but he said it. What do you think diplomatically saying something like that from the most powerful enemy in Putin's eyes? His most powerful enemy says, he looks into my eyes and sees an honest person that he could trust. What do you think the message is to him? Trump goes to Moscow, as he did several times. And by the way, we'll talk about it now. Trump goes to Moscow. After one of the news conferences, Trump and Putin have a meeting with the press. And I couldn't believe what was happening. One of the American correspondents, I was so happy he did this. He stood up and he said to Trump, every one of America's intelligence agencies has warned you that this man is using computer technology to disrupt the working of our State Department, to disrupt important elements in our society, to separate us from NATO, and to cause havoc in our foreign policy. Every single one, the CIA, the naval intelligence, the army intelligence, NSA, they have all told you that this is going on. What do you say? Do you believe? The question was ultimately in the end, I was paraphrasing, obviously. Do you believe your intelligence reports? And Trump says in front of Putin, in front of this international press conference, I have dealt with this man and I don't believe the intelligence reports that I'm getting. In other words, I believe Putin. Now, what do you think the message is in the minds of a person who slaughters individual protesters in the Soviet Union by the thousands? What do you think the message is to this guy who's been complaining about Western foreign policy for 10, 12 years? So the point of all of this is that Putin believed this was his moment, February 24th. The Europeans will not impose effective sanctions. The Europeans are dependent upon gas and oil. The Americans are totally useless. They will never stand up to me. And so he invades Ukraine, and that is where we are today. So I'm going to stop there because I see I'm taking more time than I wanted to, because I really want to invite your comments and your questions. And thank you very much for attending and listening to what I had to say.
And Gene, thank you very much. As always, you're just a wealth of information, and you laid it out very well, the history of the situation and also what's happening today and what brought us to this point. So I think if anybody has any questions or comments,